All right. So again, welcome to our Helping Students in Distress session in spring semester of 2023. And we're going to start by diving into the big question of what do I do when I encounter a student in distress, and then we'll move into talking about our specific resources. So the first thing that we suggest from the Counseling Center perspective is to hold a trauma-informed perspective. And that means just taking into account some of the great information that we're learning about how to support folks that are in a vulnerable state because of things that they've experienced. And a couple of the things that we highlight, and then there's a whole other workshop on this if you want more information, but a couple of things we keep in mind as we're thinking about being trauma-informed are instead of having kind of a punitive mindset of the student has done something wrong and they need some consequences in order to learn, don't do that again. That doesn't tend to be the best way to keep folks enrolled in school, to make them feel supported, and to give them the resources that they need to be successful. So instead of a punitive mindset, we encourage folks to try and take a restorative mindset. What will actually restore the student to right relationship with the campus, to provide them the resources that they need to be successful, and to be able to move forward. So thinking from that kind of perspective is sometimes a big change for us as we're thinking about how to respond to situations. But in general, we want to, when we hear about a situation where a student is distressed, maybe disruptive, maybe exhibiting some signs and symptoms that we're not sure how to deal with, to first think about what might be happening for the student that they are showing, this kind of reaction, and are there resources or connections or support that would help them to be more successful. So it's changing the question that we're asking from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, and what is happening in your environment that we can maybe provide some resources for, so that you can kind of come back to be as successful as you can be. The next point that we wanted to make is to create intentional connections. This is something that we find on such a relational campus as Cal State East Bay. Feeling a part of a community and a supportive community that's here to, again, bring resources around a student and think holistically about what they might need is the thing that has been the most helpful for students. So especially during the pandemic, we've been surveying our students and saying what has been helpful in you staying in school, staying engaged, moving toward graduation. Students have told us if there is at least one person that's like, checking in on me, making me feel a part of the campus community, even when I'm not on campus as much if I'm taking classes remotely, that makes all the difference. So we all have the opportunity to be that person that is taking extra time to check in with the student, that's noticing when they're not coming to class, that's asking those extra questions before we get into kind of the nitty-gritty of a meeting with them or get into our classwork. Just how are you doing? What's going on? And if we notice that there's some hardship or something, asking some questions about that and asking what kind of support they might need. So thinking about first just making space to check in with each other and creating that kind of community. And then also following up if we notice that somebody is not able to engage in the way we wish they were or that they usually are, kind of asking some more questions. Hey, how are you doing? I noticed that you didn't come to class. I noticed that assignments have been coming in late. I just wanted to check in and see how's it going? Is everything all right? Is there anything I can do? So again, not from that punitive perspective, but from a really supportive perspective of how might we be more helpful. The next thing is to make support resources visible. And so to really talk about programs like Pioneers for Hope, our basic needs program, in a way that's very matter of fact and just kind of braided through everything that we do, putting it on your syllabi, talking about it in a really open way, saying, hey, you might know a student who's interested in this program. That kind of language breaks down the stigma of like, only when there's something wrong or I hear that there's a problem do I bring up these resources, and instead saying, the cost of living in the Bay is really high. We know that all of us need these resources. Here are the resources we provide to our students and to our campus. So making the resources visible regularly mean that students get used to hearing about them, and that when they are in need or when they hear about a friend who's in need, they can more easily say, oh yeah, I think there's a food pantry on campus, let's go there together. And it just makes it a normal part of life on campus and how we're supporting each other. Students also need to hear about these resources, usually multiple times before they feel comfortable enough to reach out. So just continuing to put it out there is really helpful. To make, have posters, make things visible, be talking about them regularly. And the next point is to model what you hope to see. So we know that we are in stressful times as a society and as a campus, and that impacts us as human beings just as it impacts our students. So thinking about how can I be a little more transparent, maybe a little more human, even in my professional role, to say, yeah, things have been hard. I also feel stressed. I also have felt anxious or overwhelmed or whatever it is that you feel comfortable sharing with the student. So showing up as a human being, and then also showing up as ways that you have been intentional or creative to get your own support, to check in on yourself, to make sure that you're doing okay. Again, to just model for the students that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to need additional support. And this is how we're doing it as professionals. And so, of course, it's okay for students to do that as students. So let me pause there. I know that was a lot of information. Any questions, comments from our presenters or from our participants about any of these points? Sounds good. Well, I have many more things to share, so let's go on to our next slide. So those were kind of general perspective things that we can keep in mind. And now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of, okay, so I have a student in front of me who's in distress. What do I do in this situation? Our first piece of advice is to try and stay calm. Students in distress might present as very agitated and kind of loud and taking up that kind of energy, or they might present as very kind of shut down and quiet, or anywhere in between that range. But especially when we hear about a distressing situation or have somebody in front of us who's agitated, it's easy for our energy to start to match their energy and for things to start to escalate. In these situations, the first thing that we can do to help ourselves and help the student is to intentionally try and stay calm. So the first thing that I do when I start to encounter a stressful situation is to take a deep breath, to remind myself that it's okay to slow down. I don't need to speed up and try and figure out everything really quickly, but I'm actually going to think most clearly when I'm in a calm headspace myself. Try not to further escalate whatever's going on with your own emotional response. So if a student is disclosing, a difficult situation in their relationships, outside school, not to say, oh my gosh, like to overreact, but to kind of keep yourself calm and matter of fact, to say, authentically, that sounds like a really hard situation. I'm so glad you're telling me this, but to not raise our energy and kind of raise their worry about telling you or having to take care of you because now you have this information. Sometimes these situations interacting with students in distress can also feel a little bit assertive or aggressive on the student's part, especially when they're looking for a service or access to something they feel like they need, and they feel like you are the gatekeeper to that information or those resources. So trying not to take it personally, knowing that the student has a lot going on, and there's probably even more that you don't know about their story and their background, knowing that they're doing their best to resolve a problem, and that the most helpful thing you can do is stay calm, stay in your professional role, and think about all the resources that you know on campus that might be of service to the student. The next thing that we counsel people to do is to be clear about your limits. So also thinking as you slow yourself down and just kind of monitor your own response to the situation, what is your professional role with the student? And also, what is your kind of personal boundary about how much you're going to take on? And that personal boundary is different for each of us, right? What are we trained in? What are we comfortable with? What kind of questions are we comfortable asking? Some folks feel much more comfortable focusing on, this is my role, this is my area of expertise, so I'm only going to ask questions about this area of expertise. Other folks are more comfortable saying, what else is going on? Tell me more about the larger situation so that I can get a sense of, are there other resources that I need to bring in? Whatever you decide as your professional boundary is okay. But it's good to have made that decision and be intentional about it as you're entering into the conversation. And then it's also important not to promise more than you're able to deliver. So it's good to make your own role and your expectations of how you can be helpful clear from the start, so that if there are things they're asking you for that you know you don't have any control over, you can be clear about that, so you're not setting them up to feel frustrated or disappointed. And not judge yourself for whatever boundaries that you need to set, right? To just say, this is what I need to do in order to do my job, to serve the next student that comes in front of me. And so that's what I'm going to do. And then I am aware of all these other resources on our campus that can fill in for some of the things that I might not be able to do. Another thing that we talk about in terms of limits is thinking about your reporting obligations. So everybody who works at Cal State East Bay, with a few specific exceptions, is a mandated reporter if students say, I'm a danger to myself, I'm a danger to somebody else, or if they talk about abuse. And so you need to be clear with yourself to say, okay, there are reporting requirements that I have. And when I start to kind of get a whiff of, we're moving into this direction of something that I need to report to Title IX, or I need to bring UPD in to make sure that this student is safe, to kind of pause them and say, hey, I want you to know that this is my obligation as part of the campus community. This is my role to let Title IX know that there's been an incident of violence or discrimination or harassment on our campus that I'm hearing about, so that they can follow up from the perspective of keeping the campus safe and kind of responding to any incidents that we hear about. That doesn't mean that the student needs to participate in that investigation, but it does mean that you will have to let somebody know. So the best thing to do is, before all of that information comes out, to kind of catch the student and say, I'm so glad you're telling me this, and I want to make sure that you're aware that this is my role and my obligation. And there are a couple people on campus that can actually have this conversation with you about sexual violence, about discrimination and harassment, without having to report to the Title IX office. So if you're not sure that you want a report to be made, let me connect you with Michelle. She's our confidential advocate, and she can have that conversation with you. Let me give you the number for the counseling center. Those are the other folks that can have a conversation about anything that's happened without having to report to Title IX. Those are the only staff and faculty that are exceptions to that reporting rule. So it's good to make that clear so that the student can make a judgment about whether or not they want to move forward to disclose to you or to take that information to somebody else. Michelle, anything else you want to add at this point about reporting and how to communicate with folks about that?
No, Shauna, you put it really well. That's what I would say about that.
Okay, fantastic. And I know that's a complicated one, so we can talk a little more about that as we go. The next thing on this list is to keep a compassionate perspective. So it can be easy when we are feeling emotional in response to a situation that's in front of us, or when somebody's presenting maybe aggressively to feel a lot of things. We want to, as much as possible, keep a compassionate perspective toward the student, to remember the context of stress and anxiety and all the things that all of us are dealing with right now. To put yourself in the student's shoes and try to find connections with what they might be experiencing. So you might hear them talk about choices they're making that you think, I would never make that choice. That doesn't make any sense. That's destructive. That's not good for you. And at the same time, try and put yourself in their shoes and think, this is a decision they're making that at some level makes sense to them, or at some level they feel like this is the best I can do right now. How can I withhold my judgment about that and just kind of think about how is it that they're doing their best? When have I been in situations where I just needed to do my best? And how can I continue to connect with them? Another thing that's important is not to minimize their experience. So I think many times we hear about difficult situations, and it's hard for us to kind of feel all of the anxiety and distress about those situations. So it's easy to say, it's going to get better, don't worry about it, you're going to be okay. And on the student's end, sometimes that feels like you're minimizing the enormity of what they're feeling, right? And so minimizing saying, it'll be all right, just sleep on it, it'll be okay, this isn't a big deal, you won't even remember this in a few years. All of those can feel really harmful to the student. And so just kind of sticking with, they are distressed, reflect that distress back to them, say, yeah, it makes sense to me how you're feeling, or this sounds like it's been really hard for you. And the last thing in this bullet point is to assume positive intent. And so to think that, again, folks are doing their best. And even when somebody is trying to get a resource from you, or get you to do a certain thing, it's not helpful to have the mindset of this person is manipulating me. I don't know if they're even telling the truth, to kind of go down that path in our minds. Students can feel when they're being mistrusted or when they're being questioned in that way. So it's most helpful to your relationship when you can assume positive intent, when you are able to take a student at their word and kind of move forward with that perspective. And then the last thing on this slide is to practice active listening. And so these are, the basic skills that many of us have learned in different contexts. But I'll just say is kind of the majority of what we do in the counseling center. Very basic skills, but very effective skills. So holding back on the urge to problem solve and jump in and tell them all the things to do, because often they have already thought through their situation much more than you have as you're hearing it for the first time. And if there were an easy solution, they already would have done it. So instead of problem solving, thinking the majority of what students are probably looking for is someone to listen to them, someone to hear their situation and be with them in it. So they're not the only one who's feeling this distress or dealing with the situation. And then you can ask them, how can I help you? Do you want some resources? I have some thoughts. I've worked with some students that have been in similar situations. Is that something you're looking for? Or is there something else you're looking for from me? And that way they get a chance to check in with themselves, like, what do I really want right now? And then using basic techniques like reflecting back what they're feeling. It sounds like you're saying X, Y, and Z. Validating their experience and perspective. It makes sense to me that you would feel this way. It sounds like it has been really frustrating. And then asking open-ended questions to get more information. So, how has that been for you? Who have you been talking to? How have you been thinking about how to deal with this situation? Just so you can keep that flow of communication going and get more information from them. So again, this slide is packed full of material. Any questions, comments about anything on this slide? Yeah, Erin, go ahead.
Well, I was just, I guess it's just more of a comment. I was just now, I'm taking notes on these points, and while, it's a great, it's a great list, right, of bullet points to keep in mind. And yet, I'm just reflecting on the fact that how much preparation in advance should be done in order to really be prepared for a situation where you're with a student in distress, right? It's going to be hard to, in the moment, learn how to stay calm, and being clear about your limits requires knowing them and understanding them beforehand. So I guess the point of reflecting on that is that it's so important to not get complacent, right? And or just to stay vigilant, right, about how, and reflective on how we interact with students. And that way, when we're in a situation where a student really is in distress and needs our help, and where maybe quick thought and action really matters, it's important to have done the homework in advance. And I guess that's what I have to say.
Yeah, that's a great point, Erin. And that's exactly why I am delighted at every face on my Zoom right now and every name on my Zoom. I think it's really helpful to have thought through all these bullet points. You don't have to memorize them. They're not going to be on your mind in the moment, but just to have done some thinking about, like, what do I want my perspective to be as I go into my work every day on these students and the situations that I'm hearing about. And then just kind of trusting that we do a lot of this work. A lot of the things that I'm talking about right now are things you're probably like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I think I already do that. But just having gone through this list and thinking about, how can I prepare myself even a little better for the next student in distress that comes to me, I think it's very, very helpful. And then also I'll just add, Erin, to your point, we're never going to do this perfectly, right? we learn from every single situation that we're in, and each time, hopefully, we learn some things that may, okay, for the next student, I'm going to be able to think of something new or do it a little bit differently that hopefully will be even more helpful. So not to expect perfection for ourselves, even as much homework as we're able to do, but just to say, these are some things to keep in mind, and then we're going to take them as they come. Every situation is different, and we know we will have to adjust and think on our feet. But I think having done this thinking helps us be more ready for that.
I certainly agree.
Thanks, Erin. All right, Rebecca, go ahead.
Hi, I think this is just a comment as well. If we practice this in our everyday lives, I mean, it's not like algebra where it's like, oh my God, I forgot everything. And there's one instance where I'm going to have to use it and then have to think back from years ago. These are, we can always be active listening. We can always have a compassionate perspective if we become these people, if we do this in our everyday lives, then it won't be a big stretch when we encounter a situation that will actually, need to be compassionate. And that I think that if we do this as just everyday people, and have it's automatically a tool in our toolbox, it's something we automatically do, it will help us when the actual emergency happens.
Yeah, that's a beautiful point, Rebecca. I absolutely agree. So practicing some of these basic skills all the time, so that we don't have to think about them. We don't have to have memorized this list. They just come up naturally when we're in the situation. Yeah, Erin.
Sorry, I just had to jump in one more time just because what Rebecca said just really struck home with me so much, because when we were going through these, I'm happy to be able to say this too, is that I was looking through, I was like, this might sound a little funny, but this is exactly how I treat how the order of operations when my wife and I get into arguments. This is kind of my checklist as well, right here, where when we're trying to understand each other, it's like, a partner that's like so important to, be in a good place with, and that you care about, like it's just very similar to like kind of how I how we'll both approach arguments with each other. And it was, it's just kind of funny because these are, I agree, Rebecca, these are very important things to keep in mind with just our human interactions, even outside of work.
That's great. Yes, these are life skills. I absolutely agree, Erin. It's not what I thought you were going to say, but I absolutely agree with it. These are skills we can use in every situation when we are relating with other people. I appreciate that. All right, fantastic. I'm going to move us forward with a few more specifics about particular situations that might come up. And I think these are some of the situations that we fear most when we think about a student in distress. Sometimes what comes to our mind is, what if somebody's suicidal, right? What if they are thinking of taking their life? So just to get really specific about that, we have, again, a whole nother workshop on I Can Help and ways to be thinking about suicide assessment and intervening if we do find a student that's suicidal. It doesn't come up all the time, but it does come up. So something to think about. But in those situations, one thing that we really emphasize is to talk directly about your concerns. And this pertains to a lot of uncomfortable topics. I think sometimes when we're getting into areas of talking even about basic needs and worrying, will they be offended if I ask, have you been sleeping in your car? I notice your hygiene is a little off. Like, is there anything that's been going on for you? Those feel like such vulnerable topics that sometimes it's difficult to ask directly about them. And yet when we tiptoe around those kinds of topics, we're giving the impression that we are not comfortable having those conversations, and we might not be a good person to talk to if they are having those concerns. So it is really reassuring to students when we can say, hey, how's it going with your housing situation? Are you getting access to all the food that you need? These kind of basic direct questions will make the student feel at ease. And if they answer, yes, I'm fine in those areas, great, we can move on and talk about other things. But if they're not, then suddenly they have somebody on campus who is aware of these issues and able to have a conversation about them. And that opens up a door to them both sharing the reality of their situation and also being able to get some resources so that they can be helped. And the same is true about suicide. To just name, is this something that's going on for you, takes so much pressure off a student who might be worried. People are going to think I'm crazy. I can't say this out loud. Folks will look at me differently. Just being able to ask directly about that opens up a conversation that a student might be yearning to have with someone. So thinking about also that when we tiptoe around hard subjects like this, it means we don't get clear information. So an example is some people talk sometimes about, like, you're not going to hurt yourself, are you? And they're trying to ask about suicide, but the way they're asking about it is not very clear or direct. So a student can hear that question, I'm not going to hurt myself. No, I'm going to take a bunch of sleeping pills and fall asleep. It's not going to hurt at all. No, I'm not thinking of hurting myself. Now, the person having that conversation has not gotten the information that they were hoping to get, and they are going to move on and not have the conversation that they need to have. So asking really directly, has it gotten to the point where you thought about ending your life? That is a clear question, and you'll get a clear answer from asking that. So that is much better information and a much better conversation than tiptoeing around things. In this first example, you can also notice that we're being really concrete with the behavior or the statements, the things that we're noticing from the student that we are concerned about. So naming things that you have observed and not interpretations of those things, but saying, I've noticed that you've been late for class. I've noticed that you've turned in your assignments late. You made this statement in an assignment, or I heard you say this to me just now. Being really concrete with what you're talking about means that they can't argue with you about your interpretation, but they're like, yeah, that's correct. Those have been late. Now let me give you a little more information as to why. And then being genuine and purposeful, not just asking these questions out of curiosity, but really knowing there's a purpose. I want to see what's going on so that I can assess what is the resource that's going to be helpful for you. But not getting into the nitty-gritty of a background situation when you're like, actually, my action step is going to be connecting them with counseling, and they're going to have this conversation all over again. My action step is connecting them with Michelle, our confidential advocate, and they're going to have this conversation all over again. That is not always the best and most welcome thing. So if it's not your role to kind of support in the details of the situation, I would not be asking detailed questions. All you need to know is this a situation that's an appropriate referral to counseling, to Michelle, to the Hope Pantry, and then you can take that action, and they can share whatever else they want to share with you, but you're not kind of making them have a conversation that they're going to repeat. Jen, I wonder if there's anything you want to add to this, especially on the basic needs side.
Yeah, I think one of the most important pieces in talking with students about your concerns is to not always have the answer, but perhaps be able to link it with something on campus. And I'll talk a little bit more about Pioneers for Hope, but I think sometimes in working with students, they just want a place to vent. And, that's okay, but we don't have to, as individuals, have, I don't know how to phrase, be the end all for all of their answers, right? So I, might let a student know, what I'm hearing is that you're having some concerns or that you're feeling isolated or overwhelmed. And so here's some friends or some departments or some services on campus that might be of solution to you, but also understanding what my own scope of practice is. And I think the more we build relationships with students, the more they feel like our family or our partners, kind of going back to that previous slide and wanting to be there for them, but also there may be individuals on campus who have the scope of practice and the licensure or the understanding and training to kind of dive in at what the root of what their concerns are.
Perfect. Thank you, Jen. All right. I'm going to go through just one more slide before we get to the great resources that we keep referencing. So another thing to keep in mind as a perspective on these conversations is that in whatever situation the student is bringing that's causing them distress, it is one of the best interventions is to connect with them. So that means both in the individual relationship that you are having with the student right now in this conversation, to connect with them, to make them feel not so alone, to make them feel encouraged that it was the right thing for them to open up with you, and then to feel hopeful about other connections that they can build from there. Know that just having this conversation is 90% of the best support you could provide to the student. The follow-up resources and the concrete things are obviously very helpful as well. But for a student to disclose this is a difficult situation, to open up about how they're feeling, that in itself, to be met with somebody who is open and compassionate and taking an interest in them, does so much to relieve that distress. So that is a lot of what the students are looking for when they come to us. And then keeping in mind that the student is already connected to other resources just in their own community. So you can think with them about who are people that you can talk to about this, who are the people that you're already connected who feel supportive of you. That can help the student realize actually they have more support than they might have thought. And then thinking about the resources we're going to present today, other resources that you know on campus, can make them feel like, oh, okay, I'm just expanding my support system, and now I have knowledge of other things, other people that I can bring into that network and feel even better about my situation. And then the last thing is to take care of yourself, because these situations take a toll on us. So we can't expect ourselves to just go to the next student in the queue for us, but take a moment to say, whew, okay, I held it together, I stayed calm, I did all those professional things on the list, and now I just get to take a moment to think, that took a lot out of me. Do I need to take a walk? Do I need to take a drink of water? Do I need to call somebody and say, whew, you will never believe what just came through my office? We are not robots. We need to take some time to acknowledge that these things affect us too. And especially being in situations where we are supporting a student that's in distress, we stay focused on the student when they're in front of us, but after they're not in front of us, we need to take a little time to take care of ourselves. So any questions, comments about these last things before we move forward into our resources? Right. So the moment you've been waiting for, the resources that are available to you. The first one we wanted to present is the East Bay Cares team. So Jen and I are both on this team. I'm going to put a link into the chat. This is a multidisciplinary team that stretches across our campus and receives reports about students of concern. So you can see a little bit on the slide about our process and who's on the team. But basically what you need to remember is when there's a situation that you feel like someone else should know about this, the care team is a great place to start to alert a group of people to a situation. And then reports will be assigned to the appropriate folks who can then follow up with the student or follow up with you. Again, to know you're not the person that needs to solve this whole thing, but there's a team behind you and around the student who can help with that situation. So please feel free to submit a care report if you have a situation that you want to alert us to. And then, as I'm saying, the team will discuss that every 2 weeks. We meet as a whole team and think about what is the best response that we can give to the student. Another resource that might be helpful is we have a couple of guides to difficult situations. So we created one for faculty through the Faculty Senate subcommittee, and then we also created one for staff, knowing that staff interactions with students are a little bit different. So these two resources are on the CARE website if you ever want to look for them, but I thought I'd just put them in the chat right now, thinking about what is a critical situation and what are situations that are a little more low level, and how do we respond to everything along that spectrum, and how can we de-escalate some of these situations or handle them the best we can in the moment. So hopefully those are great resources for you all to look through. If you have questions about anything on this, feel free to reach out to me and I'd be happy to talk about it more. And now we're going to move into talking about Pioneers for Hope and basic needs.
Absolutely. Some of you may be aware of Pioneers for Hope, which is our basic needs program here at Cal State East Bay. It was initiated about 6 years ago. It's a comprehensive set of services to be able to support a variety of basic needs, but most specifically addressing access to food, supporting students' financial crisis and looking at supporting students who may be housing insecure. One of the things that's great about Pioneers for Hope is that although it's located within the health center, we really provide services across the campus, and we're connected in a variety of different places. We have a really active Instagram. If you are active on social media and you follow Pioneers for Hope, not only is there information about our services, but just a lot of the happenings that are occurring around the campus. One of our students is a master's in the fine arts program and does a lot of great coverage. So I recommend for everybody to follow Pioneers for Hope. Hope stands for helping our pioneers excel. And we're really mindful about referring to our program as Pioneers for Hope and not Project Hope, because projects typically have an end date, and there's no end date in supporting students with basic needs. Just to give you a sense of the scope of the work and the need for students, about 50% of students have indicated that they were facing some level of food insecurity within the last year. And about 10% of students have indicated some level of housing insecurity. You can go to the next slide, Shauna. Excuse me. When we're thinking about access to food, there's a few ways that that can happen. We do have a food pantry located on the Hayward campus, and then there's a food pantry at the Concord campus as well. Our pantry is not just canned foods. We have everything from bread, milk, chicken, eggs, yogurt, coffee, cookies, sometimes granola bars and fruit snacks. And so we want students to be able to access food, not just an old can of tuna that somebody donated. Yeah, eggs, absolutely, Carmen, but a variety of access to fresh produce as well. We partner with Alameda County Food Bank, where we go a few times a week and pick up food and bring it back to our campus. Because of the demand, it is by appointment, and students can make appointments through Bay Advisor for the pantry. The hours are somewhat limited, but if there is a student who's in crisis and they need food at that particular time, you can always contact the Hope office. And if we have somebody available, we more often than not are able to support them. We know that access to the food pantry is not a solution long-term, but more of a temporary fix. And so we will connect students with resources like CalFresh, which I'll talk about in just a moment, or with food pantries in the community. We also are talking with students in a more global sense about how do we support them holistically. And oftentimes when a student is facing food insecurity, there may be financial crisis that's going along. So talking a little bit more about supporting students in distress, when they come, the student might present with the issue of access to food. But then when we ask a few more questions and we're talking to them, it could be that maybe their parent is in a hospital, and we know that many of our students are supporting their families as well. So maybe most of their out-of-pocket expenses are going to help cover medical bills. So we can talk to them about what might be some other resources that are available to them. And we do have an emergency financial support scholarship that students can apply to. The funds are provided to us by donors and by grants. The maximum amount of award that a student can receive is based on a few factors. So if a student comes and says, I need $2,000, we might not be able to provide all of that. But we'll look at the student situation and we take it on a case-by-case basis. We work closely with financial aid. And as funds are awarded to a student, it's based on their cost of attendance, not necessarily cost of living. So there are certain parameters that not just Cal State East Bay, but all CSUs have to follow in giving financial awards to students, but more often than not, we're able to support them and the money can be direct deposited into their account, or they can receive a paper check. We also follow up with the student about what are some other resources that they can access. So it might be getting discounted access to internet, or it might be following up with finding a job on campus, or getting connected with some other campus departments to kind of not just address their immediate concern, but also thinking more long-term about how we can support them. Next slide. One of the things that is a benefit to our campus is that we have now a CalFresh coordinator who was just hired at the beginning of this month, and CalFresh ambassadors. Looking at the Chancellor's Office recommendations, signing students up for CalFresh is very high on the list. And if you're not familiar with CalFresh, this is access to food that students can utilize in the community. It is referred to as SNAP Ed or food stamps. And so we can support a student in signing up for CalFresh. There is a lot of eligibility for students. And as long as they're meeting those requirements, which could be being eligible for federal work study, or it could be living in a household, and so there's a combined application with other individuals who meet those requirements, they can get up to $280 per month for food. I see in the chat there were a couple of questions about, are these services only open to students? Primarily, yes, but oftentimes we do have pop-ups that happen outside where we will invite the campus community to come get access to groceries or information about CalFresh. You can email us at hope@csueastbay.edu, or you can feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any questions. For the purposes of time, I will pass it on to the next presenter.
Perfect. Thank you, Jen. So we're going to go to Michelle now to talk about confidential advocate.
Yes, so like I mentioned in the beginning, I work with students, staff, and faculty dealing with sexual violence, domestic and dating violence, stalking, and retaliation. I am not a part of Title IX, but I do work really closely with them. So anytime that they have a case involving these things, I am looped in and am able to reach out to the student for support. And then I also provide the student with information regarding the Title IX process, or if they want to report externally to law enforcement, I also provide that information as well. One really important thing to remember, and Shauna touched on this in earlier slides, we want to be really transparent with our students when we know that we are mandated reporters, and this is to minimize, they're coming from a place where control has been taken away from them, and we really want them to have that control to say, no, I don't want to report, or yes, I want to report. So if you sense a disclosure, be really clear. I'm a mandated reporter. I would have to report this to Title IX or to law enforcement or both. And if that is something that they don't want to do, then absolutely referring them to me and telling them that there is a confidential source on campus. Or give them that option of, asking questions hypothetically. That's also a way that they can be protected. And whether or not they report to Title IX, refer them to me. I think that's it. I don't know if we're good on time. And yes, this is my contact information. I know sometimes there's situations where you're not sure if you would be referring them to me. Just reach out. ask the questions. I'm always happy to answer questions.
Fantastic. All right. If there are questions, you can put them in the chat, or Brenda has a quick question about for you, Jen. Do you work with APN on campus to connect students with information on their food distribution event?
That's a great question. Right now we're not doing that, but it's something that has come up. And so, Brenda, we can talk offline about it if you're interested.
Excellent. Great questions. All right, I'm going to continue to barrel forward and talk a little bit about counseling services. So counseling services are for any personal mental health concern. So we do not provide academic counseling, and I know there are a lot of people on campus whose title is counselor. We are the mental health or personal counselors on campus. Our services are free, and I could kind of put that in air quotes because they're free because students pay for them. They pay a health fee every semester when they register for classes, and that covers our services. We offer individual counseling, one student and one professional counselor. We have a number of groups, and I'll talk a little more about that. And we also have crisis counseling sessions available every afternoon. So between 1 and 2 p.m. and from 3 to 4 p.m. every weekday, we offer crisis sessions. We offer both in-person counseling sessions at our Hayward campus, on our Concord campus. We have a counselor that's embedded in housing, and so she has an office in Sequoia. And we also are connected with the Student Equity and Success programs and have an embedded counselor that's going to start at the beginning of February to serve those programs. So we can meet with students in person in all of those locations. And we also have telehealth appointments available, so students can access us there wherever they are and have a session over Zoom. All of our services are professional. All of our counselors are master's level or PhD level folks. They are all confidential and they are all voluntary. So even if everybody on campus thinks it's a great idea for a particular student to connect with counseling services, unless that student is bought in and says, yes, I want to do that, they are not mandated to come see us. Here's a little bit about our group counseling options. Most of these are over Zoom. So groups about anxiety, about depression, about coping skills, relationships, queer and questioning support group are all over Zoom. And then our creative healing group is actually going to be in person on Fridays. So if you have a student that wants to come engage with some creative arts activities and think about healing and support from that perspective, send them over to Student Health and Counseling on a Friday. And I put a link in the chat that has the full schedule of these events and how to register. So in terms of accessing counseling, students can schedule appointments online through our health portal. They can also call our main number or email this email address on the screen. If they can't find an appointment online, then they can have a crisis appointment, or we'll do our best to make sure that they get seen as quickly as possible. After hours, so on the evenings or weekends, we do contract with a phone crisis service. And so if students dial our main number and then option 2, then they can connect with that service and get some immediate support. And then we do get messages from the protocol service after each call from our campus. So we're able to follow up with students that call that number. That number is also available to you all as staff and faculty supporting students. So if there's a situation where, whoa, I just got this email, it's the middle of the night, I don't know what to do about it, you can call protocol and kind of consult with them about how to follow up. And then again, we'll find out in the morning and we will get in touch with you if needed. The last resource I wanted to put out there for us is called You at East Bay, and this is something that hopefully folks have heard about, but it started on our campus over the summer, and so we were putting it out in all of the orientations. This is an online platform that is just full of information for college students about their mental and physical well-being, academic and career success, and purpose and campus connection. So it both has general resources and kind of blog posts about different topics, and it also has campus-specific resources. So it links into all the different student services that we offer at East Bay. Students can register through their NetID and password and get access to this platform. And then they can take inventories in different areas to say, how am I doing in these areas and how can I do better? They can set goals and come up with specific ways that they'll get reminders through their emails about how are you doing on this goal? Have you engaged as you intended in this particular activity that you thought would be helpful in your goals? So our GS classes are engaging with this platform. A lot of other instructors are using it. Our academic advisors are using it as they speak with students, but it is a great resource for our students. And staff and faculty also have the ability to set up an account and just see what's on there and think about how this could be a resource that you use with your students as well. So we wanted to let everybody know that that is available. And then the very last thing I wanted to put in the chat is if all of this flurry of information hasn't been enough for you, we do have a follow-up session for everybody who's attended all of our Wellness Ambassador training. So I just put that information into the chat. Our follow-up sessions are generally not so much content, but time to talk about what did I learn? How am I using it? How is that working? What are other ideas that folks have? So if you want to be in that space with us, we would love to have you. So that is our material for today. And I will open it up now in our last minute for any last questions that folks have. So you can either unmute and speak out or put it in the chat if you have a question for us. Overwhelmed or put you all to sleep. I know it's a lot, and I know it's a lot to absorb, but one of the outcomes that we want from these sessions is for you to just know who we are and a little bit about what we do. And what often happens is once we have met you through these workshops, we get a lot of emails or phone calls of like, Jen, I had this situation, Michelle, I have this situation, and we love that as well. So to be able to consult with you about a particular situation, even before, as you're just deciding, is Hope a good resource? Is the Advocate a good resource? We're happy to do that as well. And then we may also be in touch with you through our care team. If you submit a report that we need more information about or want to follow up about, we can do that as well.
I just want to add that this is great to know who you're meeting on campus. While I'm on campus and I see Shauna, I didn't know all of this. Rebecca, I see you. Jen, Brenda, I see you walking about, and we may have crossed paths, but we didn't know where each other's departments were from. So this is extremely helpful, in my opinion. So I'll know if, in the nearest future, I need help for any particular reason, I know who to go to, because again, it's who you know everywhere and in life in general. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carmen. I do think it's who we know as staff, and then also for our students, right? You're creating a network where you can say, oh, I know Jen, I know Michelle, and I can connect them. And that is much more effective than just saying, yeah, there's something called Hope, look it up on the website and get in touch with them, right? Students aren't really going to respond to that. Thank you, Carmen. Other last thoughts or questions?
No, just that to dovetail off what you just said, Shauna, I think sometimes that warm handoff and working with a student in distress is what's going to be the most critical in getting that student to those support resources. Because when I've worked with the student and they are feeling overwhelmed or emotional, and I'm like, here's the resources for counseling, or here's the resources for something else, saying, would you like me to sit with you while you make that appointment? Or I can initiate an email and connect that person and then step back. And that might be the connection that we all can provide as a campus community in creating that wraparound service for students. And then they continue to feel supported rather than us handing them a brochure or a piece of paper.
Well, yeah, Rebecca.
Yeah, I agree with that. Although we don't get students in distress with regards to what we're talking about here, we'll get students who are upset because of their classes, and knowing and actually physically walking them over to student affairs or walking them over to the provost's office, handing them off to our colleagues whom we know and who can deal with it, and actually even making a phone call beforehand. Hey, can you hold on? Let me find out exactly who to refer you to, and then let me walk you over, or let me connect you. It is huge in dealing with students and making them feel comfortable and diffusing a lot of times.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Rebecca. All right, I know that folks have to jump off. It's 1 o'clock, and so feel free to leave if you need. I'll follow up with an email that has the slides and all the links that we've talked about, but I'll also hang back for a couple more minutes if there's any last questions. Thank you again so much for joining us today. It was great to have all of you.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thanks. Bye.